Welcome back, guys. If you don't know me, my name is Portswill. I'm a producer, audiophile, and an IT nerd. And today I want to be talking about vocal recordings and mixing vocals. So let's jump in. Okay, so I have a new song that I want to release very, very soon. And that gave me the idea for this video, really, because most of the process that I do for vocal recording is second nature by now for me, but it might be new for you. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking about three different topics today. The first one is focusing on what happens before you actually start working on the file itself in the box. The second is the clinical objective aspect of mixing vocals, and then the third one is the artistic side of things. So starting with the first one, I'm not going to be presenting it here, and I'm not going to be deep diving into that, but you need to understand, with everything when it comes to recording, the the quality of the recording itself will dictate how the end result will be. So if you feel like the recording is not really good, try to avoid fixing it in post, okay? So if you can, try to ensure that you don't have plosives, for instance. That's one of the biggies. And the vocalist is not too far or too close to the microphone. And again, I'm not gonna be talking too much about that. Those are very, very basic stuff, really. But you need to be focusing on that. So the second topic is, well, I mean, not a lot of people think about it this way. I have this philosophy that with pretty much anything mixing and mastering, I split it up into two parts. The first one is the clinical, sort of how I call it, objective side of things, where you really approach it in a mechanical way, sort of where you fix certain problems and you establish a baseline. And then after that, you start working on the artistic side of things, and that covers all the effects and coloring. Myself, I'm a big fan of Isotope RX Suite, and you can see here that I have one of the recordings for the vocals, and that's the lead vocal and part of the lead vocal, actually. So what I always do is I open every file in RX, and I go through, I listen all the way through to ensure that I don't need to re-record this project or this particular phrase. And then I listen for issues, really. And there are a few typical issues that you will have. The obvious ones are, breath sounds. You don't want them to be too loud, but you really, you want it to be natural. So I will want to tame some of the breath sounds. What I do, though, in the RX here, and that's RX7, by the way, if you're wondering, not the newer version, I'm gonna be declicking. So you will have those kind of clicky noises that comes from the saliva, really. So those mouth noises and clicks. And so I really want to get rid of those to have a professional sounding vocal, and you can't really do much with that. I mean, you offer enough drinks or enough water to the vocalist, but then again, you will have these kind of problems anyways. And I think that's one of the biggest issues. And the third one is the noise itself. So with any system, you will have inherent noise, and in certain situations, when you add compression, you will just hear it a little bit more. For the most part, if you have a good quality system, you will not need to do anything with that, because the noise will be so low that you won't really hear that in the end result in the mix. However, if you're OCD about this, and I'm a little bit OCD about it, I tend to use a tiny bit of voice denoise here, but noise reduction, really. And in this particular instance, we have a tiny bit of high frequency noise that I wanted to remove. That's just the inherent noise of the whole recording chain. So let's listen to the vocal itself first. And what I'm going to be doing is enabling the declick algorithm, which I always set to the multi-band random clicks here. And that takes care of pretty much all of those saliva noises. So what I'm going to be doing is, first I will just let it run so that you can probably hear it. And then I will be clicking here on the output clicks only, which is the delta. So you will only be hearing those saliva clicks in the recording. So you will probably understand better what I'm talking about.
Take it all and just walk out the door. You made me feel some type of way. Take it all.
Okay, so you probably have heard those noises, and again, those are something that you can't really do much about during the recording phase, but it's very unpleasant for the ear, and you really want to get rid of those. So that's these are my settings really. I use a relatively low sensitivity, again, in the random multiband algorithm. And then what I normally do is I just select the whole file, the whole stem, and I click on render. And in this particular case, which is only a section of the chorus, you can see that 270 clicks were repaired, which I think originally was like 600 or something. So yeah, it's a very, very good algorithm, and it takes care of these problems a lot. And then the second one I use for noise, if I really have to, is the voice denoise. And again, here you could use the learn function and just play through a section when there's only noise and no singing really. Or you could use the adaptive mode, which I did here, and set it for dialogue and gentle filter type, never surgical. And I just use a very, very low threshold and reduction as well. So I don't really want to alter the high frequency content of the vocals. So denoising in general has a tendency to make the voice sound artificial and just ruin the top end of the frequency spectrum, and you don't want that. So this is a very, very gentle setup. I always listen to it multiple times just to ensure that I'm not ruining it. Okay, so there you have it. This is what I do with every single one of the stems that I use, or the recordings that I use. And then in Ableton Live, I will be inputting all of the recordings. And then I know that I have a relatively noise-free, click-free, plosive-free recording, which then I can start clinically adjust. So what I did here, by the way, is just for you to understand, is I have all of these different, in the mixing, all of these different groups like bass, kick, percussion, what have you. And then again, I have the vocals in a group which has subgroups like on top of the ad libs, lead vocals, and you can see here the lead vocals. And then I have dub vocals, which is recorded separately, so left and right channels. And then I have the harmonies, low and high harmonies, again, separately recorded for left and right channels. So what I do is I import all of these files and I go one by one and listen to them again, ensuring that there are no issues. And then when it comes to, let's say, the lead vocals, which will be a good example on how I approach really still the clinical side of mixing vocals, is with for instance the lead vocal, I wanted it to be very, very clean and in a little bit in your face, right? So not really hip hop type in your face, but still in your face. This is an EDM type of song, and yeah, you don't really want to have a huge dynamic range. So the first thing I do is I use a compressor with a relatively large knee, and in this particular case, I think I used around 5 dB reduction here. Right, so it's around 5 dB reduction. Bear in mind I cut off some of the low end here in the sidechain section. And then I use, so yeah, I'm taming the dynamic range. Vocal is one of the most dynamic instruments in the world. You really want to tame the dynamics, so don't be afraid to do that. Then after taming the dynamics, I always go to my de-esser, which is Pro DS, and you can really use pretty much any of your built-in plugins in your DAW, whatever you use. Pro Tools has a compressor setting that's specifically for de-essing, and you can use any compressor with a sidechain input set to those frequencies where sibilance is. Pro DS in this particular instance is de-essing around 5 dB. So you heard like just that part, it's also highlighted. It took off around 5 dB in that frequency spectrum. So I always try to tame those S's, and that's normal, you know. And then comes my first EQ, and why I say first is because I have multiple EQs and multiple compressors throughout the mixing chain. And the first one is always, here the focus is always correction. I want to establish a balanced sound. And in here you see it's a little bit complex here. What I was focusing on is first removing all of those harsh frequencies that I don't really like in the vocal, and then second trying to really bring out some of the detail and clarity in the vocal. And that's different for every singer, depends on the microphone, a lot of other factors. But here, usually what I focus on is taking out the very low end. You don't really need those sub frequencies in a vocal. I tend to also remove some of the bass frequencies, specifically focusing on between 100 and 200 hertz, and I just sweep the EQ filter there and try to listen to it carefully. And I can show you how that sounds.
Cause when I look around, I am done. Don't wanna see you around.
Okay, so you probably have heard the different frequencies here, and again, I don't want to go very deep into it. There are a few frequencies I always check, and I mentioned between 1 and 200 hertz. I always check 280 or around 300 hertz, and I usually remove that. For establishing a balance, I did not remove it just yet here, and I use a very broad EQ just to bring up some of those low mids. I removed a frequency. I was referencing the vocal to another one, and I found that 660 hertz here was problematic. And then I brought up some of these 2.6K, which in Julia's voice sounded smooth. I wanted to bring that out a little bit, and it felt good with all of the other instruments playing at the same time. But then I had some resonant frequencies around 6K, so it's always good to check 5 and 6K. And I brought up some of the air frequencies, which here it turns out to be 8K. But again, it's different for every vocal recording or vocalist. And it tends to be, the air, I think, tends to be from 8 to 10K. Really, it's not set in stone, so you need to play around with that. And then I also removed a tiny bit of the top end of the frequency spectrum. So then we arrive to a point where I'm relatively happy, and I would say this is where usually the corrective mixing ends for me. But I still don't want to talk about the artistic side of things just yet, because there are an in-between set of plugins that you could also use, and as you can see, I was using it here as well. One of them being Soothe 2, which is, I can't really replace it with anything else. This is really, really amazing. And this is really just to soothe the vocal, and it's the vocal de-harsh template is used here, or preset rather. And it's trying to remove the resonant frequencies across the whole spectrum dynamically. So it's not like setting a dynamic EQ in a set frequency. It is very dynamic, and it's very, very good. And yeah, I mean, I'm using it in soft mode and in parallel 50%. So but it's still noticeably better, the vocal with Soothe 2. Spiff is the other product of this company that I really, really like, and this one was originally designed to take out those click sounds that I talked earlier in the video about, those kind of saliva clicks and noise. However, I don't find it to be as good as the isotope tools to remove those. This is really for transients, bringing out transient detail or taming transients. And in this particular case, there is this preset called Forgot the Pop filter, which is focusing more on the sub or bass side of things, and it's looking at overly aggressive transients and taming them. And I found it to be very, very good. Really tamed some of those lower frequency transients. And let me just give you an idea what that does. I will be clicking on the delta again here, so you will only hear what's being taken out from the vocal recording. Let's listen to it. Okay, so it was very interesting. It's I don't really need transients there, especially in the lower spectrum or the bass section here. So I found it to be extremely useful for this scenario. And there are a lot of other plugins you could use here that are in between when it comes to corrective mixing and artistic mixing. And now we arrive to the artistic side of things, and this is where, again, I would apply multiple stages of compression and EQ. And usually how I like to approach it is use more plugins. I don't like to use one compressor to do everything. I like to use multiple compressors. So even though I was reducing around 5 dB of those dynamic swings in the vocal recording, I now will be more gentle with the compression, and I'm going to be using it more as an effect. So I hope that makes sense for you. It's a different way of approaching things. Different kind of EQs and compressors have some sort of color to it that nowadays is extremely good in the box as well. And so one of my all-time favorite plugins to use on vocals is the 1176, and any of these are really good. I happen to have a suite from Arturia, a lot of plugins from Arturia, and I generally use this Comp Fat 76 replica of the 1176. What it does for me, at least, and how I hear it, is it just brings the vocal in your face, closer to you as the listener. And I didn't really want to go super hard on this, so it's reducing. Let me just check. Yeah, so it's reducing around 1.8 dB around there. But it's in parallel mode, so the mix knob here is set to 68%. So overall, I'm only reducing around 1 decibel, which is not a lot, but still it has a color to it, and it brings the lead vocal, a little bit closer to you as the listener, and I really like that. So that, again, this is an artistic choice. It's up to you how you set it. But this is how I did use it. And there are certain plugins you need to really try all of them that you have and listen to it closely, what it does to the sound overall when it comes to coloration, really. And then I have another EQ, and why I have, so again, this might look controversial because I'm reducing certain frequencies that I set very differently in the first EQ. However, this was put on at a later stage of mixing for a very different reason. So first, when I go through one by one all of those major vocal sections, I do the same thing all over again. So I apply maybe a different type of compressor, but generally speaking the same thing, taming dynamics, taming sibilance, and then using an EQ to balance the overall sound in general. And then comes the taste aspect. So that's why I have another EQ here. And by the way, I have another EQ on the bus as well. But again, it's at a later stage in the mixing phase, okay? So this is when I'm listening to all of the other instruments as well, and I'm trying to get rid of masking frequencies. I'm trying to ensure that in the mix the vocal sits well, okay? So it has a different purpose. I don't really want to go back to my first corrective EQ because more often than not, I will be coming back to this one and changing this throughout the mixing process multiple times. I want to establish a baseline, and I mentioned it multiple times. I don't want to mess with my baseline, okay? So this is why I'm very specific when I start out with every single instrument and pretty much anything in my mixes. And then again, I will be just coloring it and making sure that it sits well in the mix. I'm using another Sooth 2 here, just gently for other purposes, and I'm not diving deep into that, and another EQ as well. And again, why it's here is because as I went through multiple times on the mix, I felt like I needed to change something, and this is like a snapshot of that. You know, there are times when I look at the multiple EQs I've done and just consolidate them together into one setting, because it's not really optimal to have too many EQs. However, in the digital domain, you will not have phasing problems or anything like that, especially with the Pro Q. I usually use the natural phase or the linear phase in medium setting. That just works well for me, and I've never had a problem where it's really altering the sound too much. Okay, so there's that, and then obviously I'm sending it to my reverbs. I'm using a I'm using a TSAR1 reverb, and on the reverb I cut the low frequencies because you do not want to have reverb on the low frequencies, generally speaking. And as you can see, I'm also using an EQ on the reverb. So that's something I usually do, and that's also to ensure that it sits well in the mix, and I'm not reverberating certain frequencies that I don't like. Then I also have a delay here, multiple delays actually set, and another reverb set. Well, yeah, so I have multiple reverbs for different sections of the song, and then I automate these. And as you can see, again, I'm cutting off pretty much anything below 400 hertz in this instance. And in this case, I'm also compressing. Why I'm compressing is because, well, that's another mixing technique, but I'm actually sidechaining my reverb to the vocal, the lead vocal itself, so I don't have too much of the reverb while there is a vocal sound. And you will have more reverb when the singing stops, actually, so when there's no signal, right? So I'm just taming the reverb a little bit when there is singing, so it's not masking the vocals too much, but it's still there. So I hope that makes sense, and maybe I'll have another video about creative mixing and effects and everything, and I did not really want to go very deep into it, but I really wanted to touch up on this as well. So, you know, you really need to ensure that all of your effects that you put on your vocal chain will, at the end, change the way the vocal sounds. And I mean, the whole balance, the frequency spectrum will feel different as well, right? Because you're reverberating the higher end of the frequency spectrum for the most part. So you need to ensure that at the end of the mixing, you take care of those higher frequencies and use maybe a multiband compressor just for those. So there's a lot to it, but at the end of the day, even when you're starting out, try using the built-in EQs, built-in compressors, and listen very closely what those do. Try to understand the options you have in the box, and try to get the best possible sound that you can. And you know, if you follow this advice, I think you can't really go wrong. This is how I approach it. I think there are as many options here as mixing engineers and producers. But again, in my mind, it's always these three sections. Ensure that you have good source, ensure that you're establishing a baseline with good corrective EQ and compression, and then try to color the sound so that it sits well in the mix, and it's your sound at the end of the day. And in this case, just a small snippet of how this all sounds together. Let me show you. Okay, and so this is how it sounds, and I hope I will not get a copyright claim later for my own song, but there you go. So I hope this was useful for you. And if you have any questions, I will try to answer it in the comments, or if you feel like you are doing something very, very differently, I'm curious how you do that, because I always learn new things from other producers. So let's chat about that and see you in the next video.